All right, folks that are joining us on Zoom, thanks so much, and we'll get started here in just a few moments. All right, fantastic. So we are streaming live on YouTube now. Thank you so much to everybody for joining us. All right, it is 6:30, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Good evening and welcome to our very first mini seminar in our series Climate Conscious NC. My name is Max Colley and I'm Program Manager for Learning Philosophy and Evaluation at the Museum of Life and Science in Durham, North Carolina. And I'll be moderating this important discussion. Tonight, our panelists, who will introduce themselves in a moment, will be discussing the science and lived experience of sea level rise here in North Carolina, which we know impacts different places along our coastline and different people living along it differently. Before we get to that discussion, I want to take a moment and thank our partners, without whom this would not have been possible. Let's go to that next slide. Great. Those partners are the Ellerbe Creek Watershed Association, SciStarter, the Museum of Science in Boston, Durham County Sustainability Office, IC Change, the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center, and the Climate Change and Society program at NC State, and of course, the North Carolina State Climate Office. I also want to note that this resource was prepared by support of award NA18SE C0080008 from the Environmental Literacy Program of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, U.S. Department of Commerce. The statements, findings, conclusions, and recommendations are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of NOAA or the U.S. Department of Commerce. Climate Conscious NC is a 6-part series, of which tonight is the very first piece. Over the next 3 weeks, we'll continue these mini seminars, bringing on experts from a number of different disciplines and sectors to help us examine the lived experience of climate-related hazards here in our state. Then, on September 10th, we'll host a public forum where you'll have an opportunity to reflect on these same hazards, your own perspectives, values, and experiences, and lend your voice to helping better understand public priorities regarding potential climate resilience and adaptation strategy and policy. Those conversations, we believe, may look similar to the model conversation that you'll hear tonight from our illustrious panel. So we have a lot to consider this evening and not as much time as we'd like. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our illustrious panel to briefly introduce themselves. Why don't we start with Melody?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. I'm Melody Hunter-Pillion. I'm the Associate Director of Communications and Strategy at the Center for the Center for the Study of the American South at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm also a doctoral student in public history at North Carolina State University with a particular interest in the heritage and culture of African Americans in Eastern North Carolina, and also how climate change and sea level rise have impacted culture and heritage in those communities. Very excited about this evening's talk.
Awesome. Sarah, you want to go next?
Sure. Can you hear me okay? Hey, I'm Sarah Spiegler. I'm with North Carolina Sea Grant. My current position is as the coordinator of a program called the North Carolina Sentinel Site Cooperative. And I'm very excited to announce that I will be transitioning to a new position with North Carolina Sea Grant on Monday as our coastal resilience specialist. And I'm really excited to be here tonight. I have my job with North Carolina Sea Grant. I focus on the impacts of sea level rise to our coastal habitats and communities. And I've worked all along the North Carolina coast from the Outer Banks down to Wilmington. I love working for Sea Grant. We provide research, education, and outreach to the North Carolina coast on topics related to coastal resources and coastal communities. And I love working with lots of different people, and I love working with the research community and the education community. And I was very excited to be invited to this event tonight, and excited to talk with Holly and Melody today.
Sarah, congratulations, and thanks for joining us. Holly, go ahead, my friend.
Hi, I'm Holly White. I'm principal planner for the town of Nags Head. I have 15 years of experience in planning with local jurisdictions along the northern Outer Banks area. My degree is in planning, and I specialize in special project management and long-range planning for the town of Nags Head.
Awesome. I'm really excited to get started with our conversation tonight. Our very first question. So first of all, we might broadly understand that the sea level is rising, but it's hard to understand what that actually means. What does sea level rise look or feel like to you and the communities you serve? What is the lived experience of rising sea levels in the areas you live and work in? Sarah, I'm going to start with you, my friend.
Okay, great. So I think that's an interesting question, Max. And I guess I'll start out with some numbers, not too big of numbers, but thinking about sea level rise, we measure that in millimeters. And so I think a lot of times sea level rise is hard for people to grasp because it's very small change over a long time. So when you think about hurricanes, that's really easy to know how that's going to impact your town often, because it's a big storm and you get lots of wind and lots of buildings fall over in one night, or a tree falls on your house. Sea level rise is a little bit harder to visualize, I think, because the sea level, what we're seeing right now is that sea level is rising in millimeters per year. So here, I live in Beaufort, North Carolina, which is in eastern North Carolina, about 3 hours east of Raleigh, right on the coast. And our NOAA tide gauge tells us that the trend right now is that sea level rise is increasing at 3 millimeters per year here in Beaufort, North Carolina. So if you think about it, 3 millimeters per year is about 2 pennies stacked on top of each other, which doesn't seem like very much. But if you think about 2 pennies stacked on top of each other for 5 years or 10 years or 50 years or 100 years, that can be, so then all of a sudden you're getting water level changes at a foot or greater. So right now, our sea level rise scenarios are telling us that in 40 years, we could have a foot of sea level rise in Beaufort, North Carolina, or possibly more under higher scenarios. And so, 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters, 3 millimeters per year doesn't sound like very much. Up where Holly lives, they have sea level rises of over 4 or 5 millimeters per year in the Outer Banks. Now when I saw that today, when I looked up that number, 5 millimeters per year, it doesn't sound like very much, but that is a lot of water at our coast. The southern part of our state in Wilmington, it's a little bit lower. It's 2 to 3 millimeters per year. But when I think about where I live, and I think about when I
Uh-oh, Sarah, I think we might have lost your audio here. And why don't we get back to you in just a second for the rest of your answer, if that sounds good to you. Holly, do you want to take over? What does it feel or look like in your community?
Sure. Sarah broadly talked about the sea level rise in general, and then the height of the rise at differing parts of our coastline. But we worked with North Carolina Sea Grant about 4 years ago to look at specifically how our citizens were observing sea level rise in our community and how we would be impacted by that. And while we broadly talked about climate change implications like intensification of and more frequent rainfall events and higher intensity rainfall events, those things were noted. Probably the most surprising thing was that citizens noted an increase in groundwater levels. So most people typically think of, I think, sea level rise as water over land, or how storm surge might impact a community with that additional rise in water level. But in Nags Head, they are observing sunny day flooding, where you have rainfall standing in areas that you typically don't see flooding, and the groundwater table is rising, which is impacting the ability for the earth to absorb stormwater runoff. So you actually have groundwater flooding versus the rainfall flooding. And also it impacts the functionality of septic systems and how, the town delivers services.
It's fascinating to think that one of the consequences of a rising sea level would be septic problems in communities like yours. Melody, same question to you, my friend.
Yeah, I'm so glad, Holly, that you mentioned the groundwater table and that those levels are staying high. So I did a series of oral history interviews last spring with African-American farmers in Brunswick County. And one of the first things they said is, the groundwater table is still so high from the last two really severe storms we have. And so even in between those really severe tropical storms or hurricanes, even, months later, a year later, the groundwater level is not going back to what they would consider what would be normal or what they have seen in years past. And so they were waiting a little bit longer before they could put their seeds in the ground, because the soil was just really still too moist for that. And so one of the things, Louis Dozier is one of the farmers I spoke with, and he was in his 80s. He says, you know what, I tell the fellows in construction, if you have a bad weather day, you're fine, you can work another day. But when we put the seed in the ground, there's really no turning back. So I think about also, Sarah, what you said about, having the numbers are so important. And then we have to couple the numbers with those stories and the impacts that are happening to farmers and communities. And what does that mean on the ground level? It really means that thing that the groundwater table's too high for farmers to put their seeds in the ground when they should be able to, that then they're not able to harvest as much as they might be able to at another time. It means climate change adds more, in particular, as we know, for marginalized communities who may have other hurdles and obstacles, then this just adds another obstacle to the struggles that they might go through. So these are very sort of, as you said, Max, also lived experiences of what seawater level or sea level rise, what that really means in terms to, folks on the ground, everyday folks on the ground, and what they are seeing and experiencing, and how it adds an extra level of struggle, perhaps, to some of their daily chores and their living capability of making a living.
Melody, that's amazing. And I'm certain that we'll want to hear more about your work with farmers and fishermen as well as we continue the conversation. I think that one particular focus of these conversations is around the rural and urban experiences. Sarah, I wonder if you can share a little bit about some of the impacts of sea level rise in more urbanized areas along the coast.
Can you hear me now, Max? Okay, great. So like I said, I live in Beaufort, North Carolina, which is pretty rural, but I do work up and down the coast. And I think when we're thinking about urban versus rural, so down in Wilmington, North Carolina, that is the most urban place on our North Carolina coast. There's just a difference in the availability of resources, I think. There's different infrastructure in rural areas versus urban areas. I think there's unique challenges in both areas. But, there's different tax bases in rural versus urban areas. And I think there's just different challenges. And so, like I said before, Wilmington actually is not experiencing as high of sea level rise as the rest of the North Carolina coast. However, they have a lot more people, you know, in the way, I guess, or near the water. So I think it's very unique to the place. I know Holly could probably speak to the rural aspect of sea level rise, living up in the Outer Banks. And I don't know if Melody has something to add about that as well, but I might turn it over to the two of them.
Well, one of the other things I was going to mention, since Holly talked about the the groundwater levels, but also saltwater intrusion is another thing too, right? From the sea level rise, is that this water intrusion that goes inland some, and where you start seeing vegetation dying, the trees dying, those sort of things. And I think that we do see that in some of these rural areas. And I don't know, Holly, if there, or Sarah, if there are particular areas in North Carolina where you've seen that more than others. I know I was speaking about this with a conference with a group of people, and someone was from Louisiana, and they were seeing that in some of their coastal areas, and in particular in the bayou and some of the islands. And I think that's happening in North Carolina as well. I'm not sure which counties are most impacted by saltwater intrusion, but that's a very real problem as well from this.
Holly, what do you think, my friend?
I have heard some level of discussion. I'm a lifelong resident of Eastern North Carolina. I actually live in Elizabeth City and work for the town of Nags Head, so I commute to work. But I do know that I have, in talking in our circles about this topic, that there has been discussion about saltwater intrusion affecting the ability for farmers to grow crops near coastal areas, like down in Terrell and Hyde counties. And I know there has been some investigation in that, even in Pasquotank County. So most, people may assume that these effects of sea level rise are just affecting the outer fringes of our coastline. But I think when you think about the hydraulic head of the ocean pushing against land, that body of water pushing against land affects anywhere that you have water touching land. So the effects of sea level rise can be felt even more in what we would consider our Inner Banks region, or our entire coastal plain. So I think we are hearing about and symptoms of sea level rise in these Inner Banks areas as well, not even just along the coastline.
That leads really well into our next question. I'm sitting here in central North Carolina and the Piedmont. Why should I care about sea level rise if I don't live along the coastline? Does it just mean I'll have a few feet of less beach line to visit on vacation? What implications does sea level rise have for folks living further inland? Melody, do you want to try this one out first?
Funny you should say that, because I was going to ask Sarah first, like, Sarah, how does it really impact us who are further? We are all connected. And I think, people think of that's some sort of esoteric thing that we say that's sort of out there, but it's really true. If there's one part of the state that's impacted, I think then we all are in many ways. If farmers are impacted, we're going to see that eventually at the grocery stores and other places. So I think that there is this sort of this incremental impact that works its way in through the coast. One of the things I also just wanted to mention when I think about, and Holly, I know that you must see this a lot, is with the different challenges that sea level rise and climate change bring, that also sort of it could worsen some problems that we see from development too. And I know that can be really tricky, this balance. But with development, some of the folks were telling me who live on the Lockwood Folly estuary in Brunswick County, with the development and then more when storms have a greater frequency, intensity, duration, that then the erosion and the amount of silt and salt and sand that comes into the creeks, it's covering the rocks that the different fish are on. So, it impacts the kind of seafood that might be available to us. It impacts the way farmers are able to bring groceries or bring produce to the markets, and that we're able to afford in some way. I think those are just some of the things that we say those are small things, but I think there are others too. And Sarah and Holly, you guys may be more familiar with those, but I see how this definitely it's something that gradually does come home to roost for all of us.
Great.
I've-
Sarah, same question to you.
Sure. Yeah, I think that was a great point, Melody. I think when I think about you all in the central part of the state or even in the mountains, I think what comes to my mind is the coastal economy and how much we contribute to the state of North Carolina's economy. So obviously, commercial fishing, recreation, tourism, but what I think about is the shipping as well. And so, we have 2 ports in North Carolina, one here in Morehead City and one in Wilmington. And I see those huge cargo ships coming in every day to our port. And we don't even have, I think Wilmington is a much bigger port than Morehead. And just thinking about, the trillions of dollars that shipping is worth in the United States. And so when you start thinking about how our coastal community is going to be impacted by sea level rise, it's going to impact, all of our infrastructure, all of our communities, everything here. And that's going to impact our economy, our tourism, our shipping. And that, like you said, Melody, we're all connected. So that will impact the rest of the state as well. So yes, I think everybody should be concerned about sea level rise.
Thanks, Sarah. Holly, last word on this question, my friend.
Sure. Just piggybacking on what's already been said, but more specifically to the economic piece that Sarah was just talking about, I think about what has just happened and what we're in the middle of with COVID, and how that has exposed weaknesses in our economic systems. But also when you think about sea level rise, the coastal areas, as far as tourism, is a major part of North Carolina's economy. And those taxes, the sales taxes that are generated as a result of those tourism dollars, feed into the ability for the state to provide services like the Department of Transportation. The services that are needed statewide, not only just in coastal areas. And so if we have a reduction in tourism because our environments are suffering due to sea level rise or the consequences associated with those, then maybe that could impact the larger economy of North Carolina. I also think about migration of people. So all these people that are living along coastlines, not even our own coastline, but from other states, and where they will go to if this is maybe a more longer term issue, but where will people go to if they're moving from a coastal area to possibly a more inland area, and the impact of increased densities in cities and what that means for provision of services and for the towns and cities that those people will be living in.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks all. So these next 3 questions are all obviously interrelated, but what sort of intersecting ramifications does sea level rise have in terms of public infrastructure, the economy or local economies, and public health? Who is at risk, or perhaps who is most at risk in the areas you serve? And what does a rising sea level mean or look like for them? Sarah, I think I'll start out with you.
Okay. So I'm going to kind of piggyback, I think, a little bit on what Holly just said. So we know that, water knows no jurisdictional boundaries, kind of like what Holly said, what we're learning from COVID, everybody is impacted. But we also know that when we have flooding events that we have impacts to our underserved and underprivileged communities, often more so than other communities. And that's for many reasons, historical injustices, a lack of infrastructure investment. We have a lot of low income and communities of color that live in low-lying areas that do flood frequently. And I think when you think about sea level rise, that's going to exacerbate a lot of the challenges that we already have with communities that live in those low-lying areas. And so how do we move forward in an equitable way, addressing these impacts of climate change and sea level rise? And how is that going to impact our infrastructure and our economy, like you said, Max? But, we often talk about communities that are going to be most impacted by sea level rise or flooding or climate change are often those communities that have the least resources to address those challenges. And so, I think we all have worked on those challenges and issues in the past, but I think they're, even more forefront, and I won't say more important. I think they've always been important, but, we really do need to think about how sea level rise is going to impact people differently depending on where they live. I think I'll pass it on after that.
Thanks, Sarah. Melody, over to you, my friend.
Yeah, I would just say we have some really hard decisions. Sarah's right. So marginalized communities, communities that have been historically marginalized, will be impacted and have been impacted the most by this. And as Holly mentioned, then you add COVID-19 to this, and it just makes the situation worse. So again, some really hard decisions to make because we weigh that against another thing, Holly, you mentioned, we need those tourism dollars too, or at least we lean on those a lot, right? But is there a different model that we have to look at going forward? Because tourism can lead to, maybe in some communities, too much development, and land that is not really staying in with some of the marginalized communities who are losing some of that land. So when you have that sort of thing, is so in this balance, which way do you go with that? And so again, I think it will take some difficult decisions and maybe looking at some different models, not moving forward in the same ways that we've done before, because I just don't know that that will work with the types of problems that we're looking at now if we're really looking at real solutions. And so I do want to really very quickly mention, Max, there is a group that is working on that. There's a consortium. It's the Coast Climates Humanities and the Environment Consortium that's made up of 4 universities. That's UNC Chapel Hill, LSU, University of Georgia, and also University of Florida, that are coming together with the Mellon Foundation grant to look at how the humanities might be involved, so that Sarah and Holly and I, folks like us, can get together from different disciplines to talk about how can we use this information together and talk to communities, hear their stories, couple that with the science, and find some new ways to have solutions or adaptive types of solutions for communities.
Amazing. Thanks, Melody. Holly.
Well, probably I would pick up on the intersection between the public infrastructure and the public health component. I think what we are, when you think about the groundwater levels and how that impacts our ability to utilize septic systems, and in Eastern North Carolina as a whole, largely, at least in the Northeast, I think most people utilize septic systems if you're in rural areas. If you're in more urbanized areas, then you may be on sewer, but the ability of those septic systems to function is in its ability to the waste to come out your septic lines and then infiltrate down into the soil bed. But if water is standing in those septic lines, it inhibits the ability for it to function and treat properly. And you may have leaching into water bodies. So users, people that depend on our water for a living, our crabber, our fishermen, that it impacts the resource and their ability to have jobs, as well as people who just enjoy the water. So we're all drawn to the coast because we love doing things that are oriented towards water, swimming and fishing and kayaking and all those things that make these coastal areas unique and special, that are centered around water, will be impacted if that public infrastructure piece, we have to really be forward looking and dealing with that. And I think also behind that, roads are the next key piece, and how our road systems are connected and how we get to and from places, and especially in emergency evacuations.
Thank you, Holly. Gosh, this conversation is really flying by. I'm going to tie 2 more questions together, just because this is such a incredible and very, very capable group of panelists that I have here. So the last question is, what adaptation or mitigation strategies are being considered to combat the negative lived impacts of sea level rise, and which are more or less popular to the people you serve or live with? The last piece that I'm going to sneakily tie in there is, what can I do to help? What should I be doing also? Melody, I'm going to start with you.
You know what I would say is we really have to ask the people who live in these communities about their own lived experiences, what has worked for them and their ancestors in the past. So a lot of times we can learn through oral histories what have been solutions in the past that we can look at. And again, I think for anyone, for any of us to say, we have the solution. But if we, and you guys, Sarah and Holly, you've lived in these communities, but it really takes the people who live there, who understand it. I'll go back to the retired shrimper that I talked to, Harry Bryant, who said to me, you know what, I'm not a scientist. I can't tell you it's climate change. I'm not calling it climate change. But what I'm telling you is there is a change, and I've seen it. Now, this guy's in his 80s. He knows what he's seen from year to year. We have to talk with people like that and record their stories and understand exactly what it is that they've seen, what solutions they think they have in mind, what they've seen in the past that they've been able to lean on to adapt to with the weather and see what works with that. But I think that is the starting stage right there, is getting those stories and working with them and finding out what solutions they believe they can bring to bear as well.
Melody, thanks so much. Sarah, over to you.
I'll give one really specific example that's becoming more popular here at the coast. It's called, the technique is called a living shoreline, and it's using a hybrid of natural elements like oysters or marsh grasses to stabilize our shorelines. And so that's instead of using a concrete bulkhead, which is man-made, and scientists are finding that these natural living shorelines are actually better, are often better in the right situation at protecting our shorelines, and can cause less erosion than a man-made bulkhead. So that's, you know, one specific thing that our management community at the coast is starting to put into place. I think you asked maybe what a less popular option is. So I will say these words right now. Holly kind of said it without saying the words. It's managed retreat. And so while we don't really think of that as a viable option right now, you know, that's moving people away from the coast. At some point, that may become a viable option. I think we just don't know yet when we will need to do that. So I will put that in the less popular column right now. As far as what you can do, I think one of the best things you can do, we probably all agree on this, is get out and vote in our elections and support people that support the policies that you think are important. Other than that, I always think volunteering out in your community, especially with an environmental organization, is a great thing to do. And of course, just stay educated and doing things like this, learning, you know, through webinars or, you know, going to museums or trying to make sure you understand what the issues are and what the challenges are.
Thank you, Sarah. Holly, over to you.
I think Melanie brought up a great point about looking to the past to kind of inform what we're doing. And I think what we have seen along the coastline here is some of the historic structures that have withstood time are elevated, you know, and that the structures that were built, people knew that they would be impacted by storm surge and that they could potentially be washed away. So they were built to withstand those effects. And I think as we move forward, we have to individuals can take personal responsibility for being informed, find out what your flood zone is, talk to your local officials. If you're even outside of a designated flood zone, are you subject to stormwater flooding or repetitive flooding in the places that you're buying? So take personal responsibility to find out what level of risk you're at if you're looking at buying a home or you're adding on or wherever you're moving, and think about those things and then take action to mitigate those things, whether that means elevating your home, whether it means flood proofing. There's a lot of great websites out there to help educate you and inform you about mitigating, and every local community has a planning department. Talk with your planners. Many planners are certified floodplain managers that can help advise you how to mitigate your home against flooding.
Max, I have a quick question for Sarah. Sarah, this, I think you said it's a living shoreline. Was that a solution that was maybe from the past that someone brought back up? Is that something brand new, or is this something we've seen in the past?
It's definitely a new technique, I would say, in the past, 10 years. And actually the permitting process for that has changed at the state level just in the past year. It's now easier to get a permit for a living shoreline, which I think is really great. It's making it easier for homeowners to decide to put in a living permit. So it is a new technique, but I think it's, using nature, working with nature instead of against nature. And I think that's a pretty old idea. So I don't know exactly how the scientists came up with it, but I'm sure they used ideas and techniques from the past as well.
Amazing. Okay, before we wrap this up, I would be remiss if I didn't give folks the opportunity to learn more about all of our amazing panelists and their work. So very briefly, Melody, where can folks go if they want to learn more about your work, my friend?
You know what, if you would please just visit south.unc.edu, south.unc.edu. That way you'll see some of my work there. You'll see the more information about CHECK, which was the consortium that I talked about, and also the podcast that has the interviews with the farmers that I was mentioning to you. It will be on that website as well. So did I say that right? south.unc.edu. Yes, there you go.
Awesome. Sarah, same question to you.
I would say the North Carolina Sea Grant webpage, which is ncseagrant.ncsu.edu. And we have a lot of great information on our webpage. If you want to contact me personally, if you go to our staff page, my email is listed under there. So feel free to email me as well.
Awesome. And Holly, over to you.
Yeah, great. You can check us out at the town of Nags Head NC.org.
Thanks. What an amazing conversation. Another goal of this project that you'll hopefully learn about as the project progresses is to move folks towards continuing the conversation and towards participating in the science that helps us to better understand climate-related hazards like sea level rise. To that end, you can visit scistarter.org/NOAA-Life and Science to find some associated projects that will help us better understand sea level rise, including Icy Change and My Coast. My final thought for the night is please keep the conversation going, and we hope to see you at the same time here next week for our conversation about extreme heat events. Thank you all so much, Melody, Holly, and Sarah, for joining me this evening, and thank you to everybody else who joined in the conversation. I hope everybody has a good rest of their evening.
Thanks, Max.
So long, everybody.
Thank you.